Reason University, the BB&T professor for the study of capitalism, and the director of the Hayek program for advanced study in philosophy, politics, and economics at the Mercatus. He's renowned for his dedication to teaching. He has co-authored The Economic Way of Thinking and has received numerous awards for his classroom. His contributions to the field have been widely recognized, earning him honorary doctorates from Universidad Francisco Marroquín and Alexandru Long from Cluj University in Romania. Also, the Adam Smith Award from the Association of Private Enterprise Education in 2010. He has served as president of the Southern Economics Association and the Montpellier Society, and additionally, he is the editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and the associate editor of the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. His notable publications include Living Economics, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and The Battle of Ideas, Economics and the Struggle for a Better World. His career exemplifies a commitment to advancing economic understanding and fostering a new generation of scholars and citizens passionate about economic thought. So thank you very much, Professor, for being here today. It's all yours.
Oh, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that. And it's a thrill for me to be here. I'm actually in honor of Hayek's 50th. I'm wearing my Hayek sweatshirt that has a picture of him on here, and it's a Christmas sweater, so it's fitting for the times. So I understand that you guys are hearing several things talking about Hayek and his legacy and contribution, and so today, I decided to talk about Hayek and development economics, and I think this is a particularly apt for your audience, because of the history of your own country. And the issue with development economics in that regard. Let's see here. So this is the world from 1850, right? I mean, Constitution, I think, is 1853. And so this is the world since 1855 to 2025, the world that's living in extreme poverty, that is on less than $2 a day. And we can see this tremendous decrease in that. I think that we should be, as citizens and also economists, really trying to understand and explain this outcome. So if there's a couple takeaways that I would like to give you up front, the first one is from Adam Smith. And Adam Smith argued that science progresses through the stages of wonder, surprise, and then appreciation. And he developed that idea in studying astronomy, right? So he has a history of astronomy book and everything like that. But I want to apply that to economics. And so the difference is that rather than looking at celestial mechanics, in economics, we're looking at the delivery of basic goods and services. So in Adam Smith's story, you have in the beginning of the book both the story of the common woolen coat, which many of you later would have heard a similar story about iPencil. So it's a common product, and then the complexity of exchanges that are required to make sure that that product gets delivered to the market to you. And then he also has the butcher, the baker, and the brewer providing us with our dinner. So our dinner that we eat every day, right, is provided to us by all these various different people engaged in division of labor. So that is the mystery of the mundane. And we wonder about how that is even possible. And so then we start to study it. And then we're surprised when we study it that it's about marshaling individual self-interest. All right. And because that's, we should get these products because someone either put them on, decided from on top that we should have them, or that out of the kindness of our hearts, someone provides us with our dinner. But instead, it's from marshaling self-interest and without any central direction. So we are surprised at that result. And then finally, once we understand the governing dynamics of that outcome, how the market process works through property prices and profit and loss in order to deliver the goods and services to us, we then get an appreciation for these things. And I think that one of the things that's most amazing to me, is our lack of appreciation of what globalization has delivered. When I first started studying economics, right around here, 40% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Those kids studying economics today are going to find it under 10% of the world's population is living in extreme poverty. So that's amazing, actually. But we don't talk about it that much. But now, at the other hand, take a look at this discrepancy, right? In in divergence. Note, by the way, in 1853, we were all poor, right? And then the question is why did some nations become rich and other nations stayed in poverty? Why is it that some nations that were poor became rich? Why is it that some nations that were rich became poor? And that's particularly intriguing in Argentina, for example, because after the Constitution in 1853, by around 1930 or whatever, the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was a thriving economy, right? And then what happened was you were confronted with, a tragic period of time led by Peronism that ended up by causing the economy to go into a spiral. And then, we've been plagued by various things ever since, right, with this. And so this explains this sort of outcome and the difference and divergence in outcomes between rich and poor countries. So this is like per capita income in Argentina, the Argentinian experience over the last time, holding these dollars constant. So you can see this decline that's happened in relative to the US dollar purchasing power. Okay, so the first thing that you guys should all be asking is, okay, so that's what happened. Now the question is why what happened. And that's economics. Economics provides the why and the how. History gives us the what. So there's what questions, there's why questions, there's how questions. Okay? The what question, that is history. The why question is now economics. And so we start to then provide an explanation for why it is that we see the pattern out there in the world. The failure of the experience to achieve modern economic growth is a consequence of monetary mischief, fiscal irresponsibility, overregulation and overtaxation, restrictions on international trade, labor market restrictions, which also include restrictions on migration, and impediments to technological innovation. All right? So you can live, by the way, with a lot of government mishaps as long as you have trade and technology constantly, expanding. So you can have overregulation, overtaxation, monetary mischief, budget surpluses. But if you actually have an open trading economy and you have the ability for people to migrate and you have the ability for people to innovate, all right, then you're going to actually be able to grow in spite of, not because of, the government mismanagement. But when you end up by killing the goose that lays the golden egg, like, for example, putting restrictions on trade by being a protectionist, or by taxing or regulating out innovation because you're worried about the precautionary principle, right? You're going to follow the precautionary principle or no harms. You're going to end up by, we'll still be in the horse and buggy. And so, yeah, you can also kill an economy with monetary mischief. We've seen that. Fiscal irresponsibility, the interconnection between the two of those. Adam Smith warned us of that. He said it was the governmental habit to run deficits, accumulate deficits into a public debt, pay back the public debt by debasing the currency. It's a juggling trick that all governments engage in. So Adam Smith's argument was we need to constrain the juggling. Keynes's argument was we need to learn how to become master jugglers. So this is the sort of the battle that is going on that we think about. So what did Adam Smith argue why it is that we've seen this improvement? So I just laid out why we see the failure to join modern economic growth. Why is it the reason why we would achieve modern economic growth? Well, Adam Smith argued in the notebooks that produced The Wealth of Nations that all that is required is peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. And then all things will take care of themselves in the natural course. All right. And so what Smith is talking about is the adoption of liberalism. That is the program of property, contact, and consent. Stability of possession, transference of those possessions by consent, and the keeping of promises. This is a system consistent with natural liberty, and it's consistent with the liberal plan for liberty, equality, and justice. This is what Adam Smith lays out in The Wealth of Nations, as well as in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Hayek, who is the modern heir apparent to Adam Smith, again, he argues and resurrects this in the middle of the 20th century, that what we need is institutions of property and freedom of contract embedded in the rule of law. Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty, is all about the rule of law, right? That's what the book is about. And following the rule of law as a norm in all policy decisions. When we follow the rule of law, we end up by having entrepreneurial discoveries of opportunities for mutual gain and creative innovation. Individuals are able to engage in productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation. Competition is seen as a discovery procedure, which opens up new and novel opportunities of how you solve problems in the world. And this unleashes the creative powers of a free civilization. Matt Ridley, in his book, How Innovation Works, captures this in a wonderful sentence that I want you to think about for a little bit. Innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. So, to go back to over here to Smith and Hayek, if the foundation of the social order is property, contract, and consent, stability of possession, transference by consent, the keeping of promises. Now, just do the thought experiment. What would the world look like in which possessions are not stably held, transference by violence, and no one keeps their promises? Now, how would the social order behave? Right? It would collapse to a war of all against all. And life would be nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes pointed out. But for us to instead engage in what Adam Smith called the human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, right? That requires us to have stability of possession, transference by consent, and the keeping of promises. In that world, the benefit of trading exceeds the benefit of raiding. In the Hobbesian world, raiding is a more successful strategy than trading. So you'll see more raiding. If you're engaged in raiding, you're going to be stuck down here. All right? If you're engaged in trading, you're going to actually experience modern economic growth. So innovation is a child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. We are only engaged in innovation when we live within a free society and individuals have the freedom to try, all right? The opportunities to try. And that opportunities to try, the creative imagination of individuals, the ultimate resource, as Julian Simon put it, is what generates prosperity and generalized prosperity. So let's think about the Adam Smith, wisdom once more. So this is the passage from which Adam Smith, I quote the thing about peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration. This is the full quote, right? All governments which thwart this natural course, which force things into another channel, or which endeavor to arrest the progress of society at a particular point, are unnatural, and to support themselves are obliged to be oppressive and tyrannical. So you can't have a democratic society that is interventionist, right? It violates the rule of law. It can be democratic in a very loose sense. But it doesn't treat us as one another's dignified equals. It doesn't treat us as, as equal before the law. It doesn't follow a politics that is neither discriminatory nor relationships of domination, right? When you're trying to force fit the world into that, your model of the world, you're the man of systems, you're going to end up by violating the rights of individuals. All right. Now, second, this is another quote, right? This is further on in The Wealth of Nations, right around the invisible hand passage. And he talks about a statesman rather than the invisible hand who tries to direct people in how they should use their capitals. And what he says is that not only should you not give this, you can't trust this authority to an individual because they won't have that knowledge, right? Right? It will nowhere be as dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. All right. So, in thinking about government, what Hume taught us was we must presume that all men are knaves. It doesn't mean that all men are knaves. It means that in building institutions, you want to guard against knavery. So, you want to have institutions in which bad men can do least harm. Those bad men come in the form of opportunism with guile and arrogance and the fatal conceit, as Hayek would later put it. All right, so this is my book on Hayek, by the way, on the my right slide. I don't know what it's looking at to you, flipped around, but I think it should be on your right as well. If anyone would like a copy of it, just email me at pboettke@gmu.edu, and I'll send you a PDF of the book. I try to lay out and elaborate Hayek's arc of his career in this book. But Hayek's elaboration on the Smithian ideas come in the form that he is the modern theorist of the invisible hand, right? He is focused, he is synonymous of visible hand and spontaneous order. Those are the same things there. And what what Hayek does, like Smith, is he derives the invisible hand proposition from the rational choice postulate via institutional analysis. So if you want to get a good handle on this, Hayek has an essay called Individualism, True and False. And I think that would be a very valuable essay to look at as you read through this. What Hayek is doing is engaging in a genuine institutional analysis, not like the old institutionalists. He is trying to blend institutions into economic analysis. And so rather than assuming the institutional framework is given, the economist must derive the institutional framework itself from the ordinary behavioral assumptions of economics. In this regard, Hayek postulates an evolutionary selection mechanism. Jim Buchanan, who's another genuine institutional economist, he relies more on the constitutional construction that takes and embodies. So the Constitution of Liberty is kind of an interesting book from this regard, because if you compare that to the calculus of consent, it would be quite a fascinating discourse for people to engage in. So the upshot of this is that under the right sort of institutional conditions of the Constitution of Liberty, right, then you can get wealth creation, which is that you realize the gains from trade and the gains from innovation. So in order for us to realize these gains from trade and these gains from innovation, we have to have the right institutional framework. That institutional framework evolves out of our evolutionary paths of problem solving. We end up by discovering that the right to private property and freedom of contract is actually the best way for us to organize our affairs and grow our economy and unleash the creative forces of a free society. That's what Hayek is doing in The Road to Serfdom, as well as in the Constitution of Liberty, and as well as in Law, Legislation, and Liberty. Next week, the current Nobel laureates are going to be accepting their Nobel Prize in economics in Sweden. In many ways, they are the grandchildren of Hayek in this sense that they are winning for their work on institutional economics. When Hayek started doing the institutional economics that he tried to do, he was viewed as leaving economics, right? But that's because it was in the height of the debate over socialism, and socialism ultimately is not about behavioral assumptions, it's about institutional assumptions. Private property rights versus collective ownership of the means of production. So what Hayek tried to do in The Road to Serfdom and then his other books was not to abandon economics, but to instead switch economists' attention away from the technical optimalities to the underlying institutional conditions that allow individuals to pursue optimal courses of economic activity. All right, so what's the continuing? This is my last slide, then we'll open it up for questions and answers or whatever. But this is the continuing relevance. I just already mentioned the Nobel Prize. This is Acemoglu and Robinson's book, The Narrow Corridor. They're trying to explain the trade-off between a powerful society and a powerful state. And their argument is that the shackled Leviathan, that is the constitutional constraints that we witness in the United States and the United Kingdom, they are what leads us to this economic growth. Just to remember, take a look here, all the way back here at this pattern. Here's, look at Western Europe, which these ideas first started in. Now look at the North American offshoots. Right, they've even done much better. All right, so that's why we have them here, and then we either have the absence of Leviathan, which is a society without a state, or we have a society of despotic society where a despotic state where you have powerful state but very weak society. And so their argument is that you have a strong state and a strong society, and that checkmates it, okay? So this leads us to questions about such as, what's called state capacity theory. Can the state actually deliver the necessary public goods and public administration? And it puts a lot of focus on the construction of the state. Hayek is challenging that idea and talking about the evolution of norms and whatnot. We have these rules not because of our reason, okay? We have reason because of the rules that we follow. And so these rules are a product of this spontaneous order as well. They're a product of human action, but not of human design. We are simply trying to solve problems locally to ourselves. And in the process of doing it, we end up by producing something which others recognize as mutually beneficial for them to adopt as well. And that's how something ends up by becoming a rule. And so that's different from the idea of allowing the state to become more and more functional so that it can deliver these various goods and services. So Hayek has something to offer the state capacity debate. Also, in respect to Acemoglu and whatnot, and here's the question that you have to ask yourself, and this is G. Warren Nutter, who was a colleague of Jim Buchanan at the University of Virginia. He used to put this to his development class, which is, how does larva become a butterfly? Right? That, can you write the model down by which larva becomes a butterfly? Because if I'm going to rely on initial conditions as my mode of explanation, right? The reason why the TIV cannot actually become the shackled Leviathan is because the stock of social capital that exists doesn't allow them to be here. And same thing in China. We don't have a stock of social capital that will allow us to checkmate the state. So we end up in despotic state. All right. So these are descriptions, not explanations. So it'd be larva, butterfly. But I can't explain how larva moves and then becomes a butterfly. I don't even have that on the diagram. You see what I'm talking about? So the role, if the role of initial conditions are the determining factor in the outcome, you actually haven't had an explanation. You just have a description. Myanmar is Myanmar because it's Myanmar. Denmark is Denmark because it's Denmark. What we as development economists need to know is, how is it that Myanmar became Denmark? Again, we were all poor. Right? It's not like the rich countries were rich and then they stayed rich. The rich countries were poor and they became rich. All right? And so that's the thing that we need to explain. All right? So Hayek that's what all of his works are, from the Constitution of Liberty to Law, Legislation of Liberty to the Fatal Conceit. It's all about that evolutionary path. And then finally, Hayek has a lot to tell us that, like, Bill Easterly is working on. So Bill Easterly has a new book coming out on development economics, which is about saviors versus skeptics, and whether or not you can orchestrate development from afar. So those poor people are in that country and they're not doing well, and I, from the richer country, are going to be able to go into that country and manipulate their economies and make them better off. Those are the saviors. The skeptics are freedom is something up to the people that are in these economies themselves. They have authorship over their lives. And so in that regard, this is what, Hayek is someone who is a skeptic about orchestrated development, but an optimist very much about open development, and the possibilities of progress. Hayek is a progress theorist, right? It's development by consent. Development is progress. Okay. So Hayek, we're celebrating Hayek winning the Nobel Prize. I think it's useful for you to read Hayek's pretense of knowledge and its relationship to what we've just been talking about. Hayek's essay is not against socialism. So again, the knowledge problem is something that all systems must confront, not just the socialist system. So the capitalist system has to confront knowledge problem, but it has a way of addressing it with property, prices, and profit and loss, right? So the capitalist order faces a knowledge problem just like the socialist order, but the institutions of the capitalist society and the practices, property, prices, profit, and loss, actually give us answers to the knowledge problem. But central planning, administered prices, all right, and soft budget constraints don't. Right? They don't allow us to solve the knowledge problem. They perpetuate the problem, make it worse. So that's why. But what Hayek is doing in this essay, he's actually criticizing standard mainstream economics at the time, mid-1970s, which was macroeconomics, Keynesian macroeconomics, what was called at the time the neoclassical synthesis. It's Paul Samuelson economics. All right. And so what Hayek comes along and you read his essay, he says the following 5 things, right? 1, we have no reason to actually be proud of what our discipline has achieved. We have made a mess of things due to the wrong theory. We followed the wrong theory, aggregate demand management. And as a result, we have screwed up that management. Why did we adopt the wrong theory? We adopted a wrong theory because we adopted a wrong philosophy of science, right? We adopted a philosophy of science which tried to make economics, the social sciences, look identical to the physical sciences. And as a result, we adopted what's called scientism rather than doing science. Now, why did we adopt scientism? We adopted scientism because we wanted economics as a discipline to be more like engineering than like sociology or history or philosophy. And as a result, our expectations for the discipline exceeded what the discipline by its nature can actually achieve. This is the problem of social engineering. We are trying to engineer a system which we, in fact, do not have the ability to control in the same way that I can do a controlled experiment in a lab. Economic life does not come to us in a vacuum. All right? Now, there's huge rents to be had. Huge rents to be had if you are a social engineer. If you're the person that can be a savior, you're going to get rewarded a lot more than if you're the person who can be a poet or a philosopher. You can actually, engineer an outcome. And so we practice a discipline, Hayek says, in which we wink at one another and say we still can achieve things which we know that we cannot achieve. And as a result, we end up by being on the border of being charlatans in our practice of economics. And unless we fix things, Hayek goes on to argue, we will become tyrants and destroyers of civilization, tyrants over our fellow citizens and destroyers of the civilization of which we benefit. Economics being transformed from a tool of understanding to a tool of social control delivered this state of affairs to us. So I just want to cycle back for a second. And, when you win the Nobel Prize, you have to give a toast at the banquet the night before your speech. And then you have to give your speech. So I just want you to think 1974, Friedrich Hayek, who is an elderly man, as you can see in this picture, is given the Nobel Prize in economics. It's only the, I think, fifth Nobel Prize in economics that was awarded. It started in 1969. It was given to Jan Tinbergen, who is an economist from the Netherlands. He's the first Nobel laureate. And he won, by the way, for his development of large-scale macro modeling. The second Nobel laureate is Paul Samuelson. Okay, so you get the gist of what's going on here. So Hayek, wins this award. He has to give a toast, and he gets up for the toast, and he says, "If I had been consulted over whether or not there should be a Nobel Prize in economics, I would have argued against it, because no economist should be given this stature in the eyes of the public. That's not, we don't have that kind of stature, and we shouldn't have that kind of stature. Thank you very much. Cheers." Then he comes the next day and delivers his speech, and he delivers these 5 points, right? And then says, "Thank you very much," and collects his, $1 million and goes home. So, it's a pretty amazing thing. It's in many ways, Hayek has given the most indicting speech of all the Nobel Prizes ever in economics. So we're here to celebrate that. It's 50 years since Hayek won. How has economics evolved in those 50 years since that time is a fascinating question to ask yourself. Has economics improved? Has the world improved in terms of its understanding of economics? Or do we still face a very serious educational project, in terms of economics? So I think we have about 20 minutes for questions and so thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd love to have a conversation with all of you. Thank you.
Peter, I want to make an announcement. And shows Iran best.
Thank you very much, Peter. Your speech is excellent. But my question would be, how could China's experience the last 40 years be seen from a Hayekian point of view?
It's a great question. If you go to the what, there's no denying if I took a picture of Shanghai 40 years ago and then took a picture and showed you Shanghai today, you would see amazing economic development, right? Right. So it's hard when you're talking on Zoom to see if people, getting your point. If I put up this picture, it would be like drastic. You couldn't understand. It was like, oh my God, there's like Mars and, this other one. It's pretty phenomenal. On the other hand, if I actually look at regions that are outside of the center of the city, right, it looks like I'm still back in 1200. All right. So what they don't have is they don't have generalized prosperity. So what's happened in China is they have industrialization, but not development. And so that's captured, by the way, if you look at, per capita income levels. I understand they have a huge population, okay? But their per capita income is still 20 times below the United States, okay? So they're at the same time, their aggregate output is growing. So everyone says, oh, look at China's growth rates. Now, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that there's a huge difference between where China was pre-COVID and where China is post-COVID. And so Xi had, first you have to make a split between Deng Xiaoping in 1978 to 1985, and then 1985 until Xi comes in. Okay, so from 1978 to 1985, they tried to institute what they called socialist accountability. They actually made things worse rather than better. Okay, and then after in 1985, they shifted and they moved to basically what might be called a reverse revenue sharing scheme. What the center said was, we're no longer going to subsidize the state enterprises, but what we're going to do is the state enterprises have to give us a fixed amount back, like a kickback. And so what they did was that's a subtle shift in the incentives, right? They changed the incentives for these state enterprises. And so that's why you get these special economic zones like Guangdong and all these other ones that had this tremendous growth, right? Because they were basically enterprise zones where they lowered the regulations, lowered the taxes. But if you made so if I have a pie and it grows like this slice of that pie gets bigger, right? So if I have a pie and it's like this only, and I give a slice like that, that's a smaller amount than if I grow the pie here and I have a smaller percentage of the slice, but it's a bigger slice, right? And that's kind of what happened. And so just to for the students there to give an illustration, there's a fantastic video by Hans Riesling called 200 Countries Over 200 Years in 4 Minutes. It's a BBC data thing. So if you haven't watched it, just look it up on YouTube. 200 countries over 200 years in 4 minutes. And what he does is he explains China going from, he divides the world into poor and sick and healthy and wealthy. All right. So in the upper, corridor over here is healthy and wealthy. Down here is the poor and sick. And he starts out, we're all poor and sick, and then you gravitate up over the last 200 years. Okay. So blah, 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 blah. Then he starts talking about China. And he gets to China, and the globe of China is quite big, right? But then when he says, well, now let's look and see if we break China down. And he takes a subset, like, say, villages in China. And all of a sudden, you pop this, and that village goes all the way back down to sub-Saharan Africa, right? On the other hand, if I pick Guangdong, right, it goes all the way up and is similar to Europe, all right? And so this is the issue, is China has very uneven development, and it's very mercantilist rather than capitalist. And so there's a lot of cronyism and whatnot and favoritism in there. And I think that's all starting to actually have a very big impact on China's future economic growth. So there's a wonderful Chinese economist named it's Wen Eng. So Wen, Yuen, and then Eng, A-N-G. And she has a couple books, but she also has a video series that the Institute for New Economic Thinking produced on China that's very valuable to try to get a handle on things. But she refers to this period in China as the Gilded Age. So it's very similar to the United States in the late 19th century, in which there's a lot of, political and economic intertwingling, that's involved. So that's how I would look at it. I'd look at, but it's a great question. And again, I might be, part of the reason for that global reduction in poverty is due to India and China being integrated into the global economy. You have large population mass, and they get integrated to the global economy, and you have less people in aggregate living under $2 a day. So that's what's capturing the large part of that. That's too long-winded, Gabrielle?
No, it's okay. Don't worry. It's wonderful.
Great. It was a great question.
Okay, he asked, what would Hayek think about the trade war between the United States and China?
So I can't speak for Hayek. I can only speak for Pete Boettke on this. But I am, so I do not buy the argument that we should have tariffs against China or anything like that. I think we should actually have quite open borders as well as open and free trade. And so I do not agree with the current upcoming administration or the existing administration, which by the way hasn't changed the old administration's policies from years ago. So I'm an unequivocal free trader. Okay, I don't think that there's any role for strategic trade. I don't think there's any argument for infant industry arguments. I don't think there's any national security reasons to have not free trade or anything like that. So I might be what you call a market fundamentalist and whatnot. But to me, I think it's a sign of our economic ignorance that we continue to deal with issues that are anti-immigration and anti-trade. Now, what I will say is the following thing. There's an interesting question about your taxing technology. Okay? So if you look at England versus France, okay, during the period of the Industrial Revolution, one of the things that you're going to see is that England had higher tariffs than France. Okay? But England had less domestic regulation of their economy. All right? And so the costs of trade were quite high at that time. So the volume of trade was not like the volume of trade we think about today. Okay? But England didn't have the kind of levels of taxation, so their resources that they taxed were through trade. So that was through their tariffs rather than through their sales tax or something like that, right? Or income tax. And so you could, if you imagine a world, look in our U.S. history past, and you could say, oh, we had higher tariffs, but we didn't have the kind of taxation we have on everything else in our economy. So that was the form in which taxation took place. And so you could make an argument that those, for example, in England, let's go back to England. The reason why England was so successful is because they had such relatively low levels of regulation in the domestically open economy, and the cost of travel and transactions within the local domestic economy were far lower. So trade was very vibrant. In the United States, we have 380 million people. All right, existing across how many different time zones? All right, now, if we actually had free trade, complete and open free trade between all of our states and migration, that would be like having Europe be a complete free trade zone. Right? Everyone understands? So we can actually have what like Europe would have from a complete free trade zone without trading with anyone else. Right, just out of our own economy, except that there's huge gains to be had from trading with all these different partners around the world, right? But it's not like going to feel the same as a smaller country that has a much more homogeneous population and is more restricted. When they try to close themselves off, they're going to be totally messed up. So I think there's, qualifying statements or whatever, but in principle, open borders, zero tariffs, let the process work. If cars can be produced better in Korea than they can be produced in the United States, let all the cars be produced in Korea, not in the United States. I don't care. As long as I get a lower price car and, it lasts longer, right? Yeah.
In the field of development economics, do you see that endogenous growth theory is at least closest than the other theories to what Hayek would say on economic growth?
So I think development economics, if I understand your question correctly, development economics since the crisis of development, the collapse of development planning, which is at times about the same time as the issues with the collapse of communism. So the 1990s were a very interesting period because one of the things that gets forgotten, because all of our focus was on East and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, is that the Scandinavian states went through drastic reforms because they're aging population. So if you imagine a world that looks like this, and you have working people here, and then you have people on the dole at the top, if you have a demographic problem, aging population and not as many people being born and the younger thing, you flip it like this. So by the 1970s, Sweden, Denmark, all those countries faced very severe problems. And by 1990, they made major changes to their economic reforms, but we weren't paying attention to them. So like people like Bernie Sanders or whatever still thinks that like Sweden is Sweden from 1965 or whatever, or Denmark. So that's why the president of Denmark had to tell, Bernie Sanders, stop using us. We're not a socialist economy. That's not, what we do. So that collapsed. Development, the failure in Africa, the failure in Latin America, the failure in all these places in development, that all came to a head in 1990s. Okay. And so, there was a crisis that was caused, and it's captured very well in Bill Easterly's book. His book that got him fired from the World Bank. And so that came out in 1999. All right. And since that time, so mark that date, 1999, and going forward, development economics moved each year closer and closer to Hayek. So this is your question. Took me a while to get there. But each year we became more and more focused on Hayek until Esther Duflo came along with randomized controlled trials. Because what Duflo did was she resurrected economic planning, but like at a very local level. So the question with Duflo is always scalability and sustainability. Like if I go into a village and I see that they don't have a school, if I build a school and educate the kids, then yeah, the kids are going to have higher levels of human capital in that village. But now can I build it for the region? Can I build it for the entire country? Can it be sustained once I leave? Right? These are the questions that these things, but if I just do a randomized controlled trial and look at a specific measure, let's say human capital acquisition, and I, devote my research to it, of course I can get that outcome. All right. And so libertarian, like a kind of form of paternalistic development was resurrected by Banerjee and Duflo, right? Which is anti-Hayek. But the stream of research that comes out of Easterly is all Hayekian. All right. And so, and by the way, so then you're in a kind of a weird world. Is the Washington Consensus a Hayekian thing, or is it a other form of macroeconomic planning? All right. And so it just, the Millennium Challenge, which is the United States emphasis on development after 9/11, which I actually, I was leading a research group and we were part of those discussions that did it. They started talking about property rights. You you guys all know about Hernando de Soto's work, right? And the issues of having to do with, basically whether or not you can turn, how long it takes you to start a business. Right? If you look at his book on capital, what he's asking the question is, how can you turn dead capital into live capital? Right? Well, how do you do it? You have to recognize private property rights. Right? The dogs recognize, what the people already know, right? So, you tell me I don't own property, but I'm sitting there as a squatter and you come by to my property and my dog barks at you. The dog already knows, right? That's what, and what he wants to do is he wants to codify that so you can turn that dead capital into live capital, right? Because then you can use it for collateralization and then you can have investment, blah, 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 and all the other things like that. That's a Hayekian idea, right? So De Soto's stuff is a Hayek, idea. So to me, I think, and then I would argue that Acemoglu and Robinson and Johnson, they're putting Hayek at the front of the discussion as well. Though they're critics, right? So I'm not saying they're not critics, but Hayek that's a lot different from Big Bang Theory. And we just need the government to dump a bunch of capital investments or build projects or go into Brazil and build like an airport in the middle of Brazil and then believe like the Field of Dreams that once I build it, everyone will come, and then no one comes, right? And this kind of thing. So those were the way we used to do these investment projects, and those are off the board in many places now. But it's still very tragic. I mean, look at sub-Saharan Africa. And these places, they haven't been unleashed to experience what Ridley talks about. Innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. So that's what we want these countries to experience. In order to get that, we have to have them have institutional patterns of freedom, and allow the citizens in those economies to be self-authors.
Thank you very much.
Peter, let me ask you a more theoretical question. What about our friends in the Mises Institute about this old article of Joseph Salerno, this homogenization, Mises and Hayek? Are they insisting in this kind of separation between the two authors, or is it now an old debate that nobody cares? What do you think?
So there's, first of all, I should point out that this is going to sound like a weird thing, and so probably too much personal history and in or out, but I was a student of Hans Sennholz. Sennholz was Ludwig von Mises' first PhD student in the United States. So I was educated in the beginning of my career, in fact, by a lot of Argentinians. I was there with Steve Thompson was educated there. Alex Chaffwin was part of that group that was, educated there with Sennholz. And Alfredo Irigoyen and his wife were there, doing this. Eduardo Zimmerman, so I have a bunch of these names that are, stuck in my head from when I was an undergraduate and they were doing their graduate degrees with Sennholz at the time. And so I very much learned in that kind of same genre of Mises is great, Hayek is a leaker, basically, was the idea, because Hayek was not as strident in his defense of the free market as Mises was, at least in rhetoric, and so I was educated in that. And also at that time, after I was first learning these things, Mises was very difficult for me as a young kid to learn. So Murray Rothbard was easier for me to read. And I read everything by Murray Rothbard. I really, was quite enamored with his ideas. And I'm a kid from New Jersey, and Joe Salerno is from New Jersey. And so as a kid, I looked up to Joe tremendously because he lived in New Jersey and he was very involved in giving talks at libertarian functions and stuff. So I was exposed to him as a kid, and I really thought the world of him, and I still do. I think, I owe these people tremendous things. However, I think that this debate is not very productive on a variety of issues, though points are made in the context of the debate, which are important. So let me just pull out the important ones first. So for example, Salerno has this idea of appraisement, the role that the entrepreneur must engage in appraisement. All right. And I think that entrepreneurial appraisement is a vital part of how markets work. And so we have to actually have that. But note when I just put that to the side for a second, because think what then is going to be what we use to appraise with? What is it that we appraise, right? I mean, and how do we go about doing that? So I think Salerno's right about entrepreneurial appraisement. I think Rothbard overstated the capital ownership position, and other people like Per Bylund today doing great work, nevertheless, but I think they overstated compared to Kerzner, because Kerzner was looking at a particular moment of the essence of entrepreneurship is the recognition of the opportunity for gain from exchange, whereas they want to see how can the entrepreneur bring that act to life. And so in a book that Chris Coyne and I wrote, we divide entrepreneurship in what we call 3 essential moments, right? Which is the first one is serendipity, the second one is search, and the third one is seize, right? And so we argue entrepreneurial action is combined with all 3 of these. But the entrepreneurial thing that starts is alertness to the opportunity. If you're not alert, you don't know what it is that you're going to search for. And then, and therefore, if you're not doing your due diligence, you're not going to be able to seize the opportunity, right? And so, for entrepreneurship to come into action, you need all 3. But for entrepreneurship to get started, you just need the recognition, which is what Kerzner's talking about. Okay, so those are background things. So here's the deal. 1, let's just take the argument. Mises' argument is without private property and the means of production, there will be no market for the means of production. Without a market, there's no relative prices for the means of production. Without relative prices, you cannot engage in rational economic calculation. Those prices are surrogates of knowledge that go into calculation. It's what allows us to calculate. So when Hayek is talking about a knowledge problem, this is exactly what he's talking about. So there is no Hayek without private property rights, right? So it's not that Hayek denies private property rights. That's a false thing. Hayek is talking about the prices that go into the calculation and the dispersal of, as Mises puts it, not Hayek, the intellectual division of labor in an economy. That's, when you read liberalism, what Mises says is that the linchpin argument against socialism is it would have to forego the intellectual division of knowledge, a division of labor in society, intellectual division of labor, right? And so we're talking about these aids to the human mind, which is what Hayek is trying to get at. So to me, Hayek and Mises are actually two sides of a coin. Okay. Now, the way to understand them, I would argue, is that Mises is arguing against early socialists who don't even understand the importance of property and prices. And Hayek is arguing against technical economists who think that you can have prices but without property. So they're coming at the argument from the same place, but to different audiences. All right. And so that means that they emphasize different things in the debate. So how can you resolve this and understand where they come from? Try to find what Hayek says when he's talking to old Marxists, and try to find what Mises says when he's talking to modern neoclassicists. And when he does that, for example, this is one of the areas where a lot of I think the Mises Institute people make a textual error. So Mises says that with full knowledge, there's still a calculation problem. But if you read him, what he says is full technological knowledge. All right. Now, in modern neoclassical economics, the ipso facto, this is Schumpeter's response to Hayek, right? The ipso facto is that if I have full technological knowledge in equilibrium, I also have full economic knowledge. The whole point of the Austrians is I can have full technological knowledge, but I don't have a means to get full economic knowledge. And so unless I have this ability to sort from the array of technologically feasible projects to those that are economically viable, right? So remember, I'm not trying to find technologically unfeasible projects. Like right now, beat me up, Scotty, and then I'm in person with you guys. That's not available right now. So, but there's various different ways. We could have done this by a phone call. We could have done it by, just computer typing to one another. We could do it by Zoom, right? What are we trying to do? We're trying to get the most, right, out of the least, right? That's we want to produce more with least, right? Use of resources. That's how you make advances, not less with more. Right? You don't want to produce less with more. You want to produce more with less. And that's the economics. That only comes about through what? The market process sorting, right? Doing this. And that's what the key idea of economic calculation is. Economic calculation sorts from the technologically feasible to the economically viable. Okay? What do I need to engage in that economic calculation? I need to have property, which gives rise to exchange, which gives me prices, which give me knowledge that go into my calculation. So Hayek and Mises are like this rather than like this. And so to me, and now it gets, squishy, because to me, a large part of the debates in Austrian economics since 1980, these debates all started before I was even involved, right? So remember, I'm a student of Sennholz back in the 70s and 80s, but Rothbard is already splitting from Cato and all these other things, that are going on. And a large extent of these are sociological, not intellectual, in my opinion. So just to use an example for yourself, okay? Fritz Machlup was a student of Mises in Vienna. All right. He is actually a direct doctoral student of Mises. All right. He is best friends with Alfred Schutz. Okay. Alfred Schutz is a doctoral student of Mises who studies the philosophical foundations of the Misesian system. Okay. Machlup is a Misesian. Right? That's the key thing. And so Machlup understands what Mises means by a priorism, by all these things like that, which are not necessarily the same context of what they would mean in Anglo philosophy, right? Mises is not a analytical Anglo philosopher. He's a continental philosopher. He's a phenomenologist. That's where he's coming out of. That's what's in epistemological problems. That's in theory and history. You know, just look at the references and everything like that. And so when people want to understand what Mises was trying to argue in the first 100 pages of Human Action, it's not like they can find it by going to an Aristotelian philosopher and then looking at the way in which they derive that. I've never published this. I think I might have told you this, Gabrielle, but I never published this. But one of the greatest finds I found when I was doing my book on Hayek, which required me to do archive work, not only at Hoover, but also at Grove City with Mises papers, but also at the London School of Economics. And I was going through Lionel Robbins's papers. And I found a preface to Lionel Robbins' The Nature and Significance that was never published, in which it's a detailed discussion of his position vis-a-vis Mises. And he takes on the issue of people criticizing Mises, like Terence Hutchinson, who thinks Mises is this guy who's making this dogmatic argument about apodictic certainty and airtight, like that. And basically it's the same argument that you and Nicholas make, which is that Robbins comes on and says, look, Mises didn't mean what you're saying he means. He's a pragmatic a priorist. It's basically this. Economics is like a set of eyeglasses. I have to put my eyeglasses on prior to me being able to read. I can't just look at the world without eyeglasses, right? I have to have a theory to see, and in order to see, I got to put that on before I can see. And then after that, the proof of the pudding is in the seeing, right? And then the issue is the testing. So go back to Mocklub. I mean, this is all, you know, second nature to you, but if you go back to Mocklub's big paper on verification, right? You know, he basically is trying to fit into an economics profession, which he's brand new to. He's talking their language. But if you read it, he even gives you the clue right there. He says, oh, rather than predictability, I would use the term intelligibility. I want to render the world intelligible, not make predictive forecasts about the world. End of story right there. So to me, I think so much of modern Austrian economics gets screwed up because of trying to claim the mantle of Mises rather than claim the mantle of science and moving the ball forward with ideas. And so that's why I'm not convinced that some of these debates are as productive as other debates. But I might be wrong about that. I might be wrong about that.
No. I think you're not. And
I know, but some people think I am. So I might, I might be. Yeah.
I'm very grateful for this wonderful answer. I wanted all the students to listen to your answer. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I also think that certain people, because of politics, were exalted in this battle that don't deserve to be exalted in some sense. And so I will say, so for example, they became like Hans Hoppe, you know, is not an economist. His work is not very good as an economist. And I wouldn't say it's very good as a sociologist either, or as a philosopher. So I actually think he's very bad, and his mores, his liberal sensibilities are bad. So he's an anti-immigrationist. He's got all these things that are not Misesian in some sense. So if you read, Mises, or he's not even Rothbardian. Read Rothbard's essay on the quest for the historical Mises. Mises was a radical liberal. He wasn't a social conservative like what's gone on, but they align themselves with the paleo conservatives and the paleo libertarians because politics is about minimum winning coalitions. And in that time in the United States, there was this possibility of a minimum winning coalition to be able to have, an opportunity for political change. But that's totally different from science and scholarship. And so I think that if I had a message to students, I would say, the biggest mistake that libertarians have made since the collapse of communism is that we focus too much on politics and not enough on culture and the creative establishment and development of libertarian ideas and culture, because we were worried about political implementation. But politics is all about minimum winning coalitions. So you wake up and you have alliances with people that you would never be with intellectually. Like you would just say like, oh no, I'm not going to stand next to this guy, right? It is horrible. And so this is what's happened is that, and now that's in many ways discredited libertarianism because it's associated with a lot of unsavory kind of ideas, which no libertarian actually ever would hold. And so the key issue is liberal libertarianism, right? Understand what it means to be a liberal, to develop liberal sensibilities about ideas, understand the rights of individuals, the dignity of individuals before the law and before one another. We're not one another's equal in terms of resources, right? But we're one another's equal before the law. And we should be stressing that and not putting thumbs on the favor or this, that group or whatever. And, anyway, so to me, I think, Austrian economics has taken some turns, which I find unfortunate. A lot of people would disagree with me about that. But I would like to see, the kind of Misesian program that Mises lays out in nation state and economy, that he lays out in liberalism, that Hayek inherits and develops in the Constitutional Liberty and Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And to be honest, because I think those guys were blinded in some sense. I actually think the best book on libertarianism that I've ever read is Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. And I think we should use For a New Liberty as a check against the illiberal libertarians that, came after him. So, yeah. Sorry for that rambling answer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we are on time, okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you
All right,
very much.
thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.